As we move on right now to another issue raised in the Republican presidential primary debate Saturday, this is Josh McElveen, the political director and anchor for WMUR-TV in Manchester.
Mr. Trump, you have said, quote, "I love eminent domain," which is the seizure of private property for the sake of the greater good, theoretically. You've tried to use the measure in business endeavors. You've said you'd support its use for the Keystone Pipeline project. Here in New Hampshire, a project, though, known as the Northern Pass, would bring hydroelectric power from Canada into the northeastern grid. Do you see eminent domain as an appropriate tool to get that project done?
Well, let me just tell you about eminent domain, because almost all of these people, actually Chris has it, but so many people have hit me with commercials and other things about eminent domain. Eminent domain is an absolute necessity for a country, for our country. Without it, you wouldn't have roads, you wouldn't have hospitals, you wouldn't have anything. You wouldn't have schools, you wouldn't have bridges. You need eminent domain. And a lot of the big conservatives that tell me how conservative they are, I think I'm more than they are, they tell me, oh, well, they all want the Keystone Pipeline. The Keystone Pipeline, without eminent domain, it wouldn't go 10 feet, okay? You need eminent domain. And eminent domain is a good thing, not a bad thing. And what a lot of people don't know, because they were all saying, oh, you're going to take their property. When eminent domain is used on somebody's property, that person gets a fortune. They get at least fair market value, and if they're smart, they'll get 2 or 3 times the value of their property. But without eminent domain, you don't have roads, highways, schools, bridges, or anything. So eminent domain, it's not that I love it, but eminent domain is absolutely, it's a necessity for a country, and certainly it's a necessity for our country.
So would that be yes on the Northern Pass project?
Josh, the difference between eminent domain for public purpose, as Donald said, roads and infrastructure, pipelines and all that, that's for public purpose. But what Donald Trump did was use eminent domain to try to take the property of an elderly woman on the Strip in Atlantic City. That is not public purpose. That is downright wrong. And here's the problem with that.
All right, okay.
The problem was it was to tear down. It was to tear down.
He wants to be a tough guy. He wants to be a tough guy tonight.
It was to tear down the house.
I didn't take the property.
And the net result was you tried.
I didn't take the property. The woman ultimately didn't want to do that.
That is not true. And the simple fact is, to turn this into a limousine parking lot for his casinos is not a public use.
So that's Jeb Bush and Donald Trump sparring in Saturday's presidential primary debate in New Hampshire. We're joined by Ilya Somin, professor of law at George Mason University. He writes for the Washington Post blog, The Volokh Conspiracy. His new piece is called Donald Trump's Lightweight Defense of Taking Property for Private Development. Somin is also the author of The Grasping Hand, Kelo versus City of New London, and the Limits of Eminent Domain. So what are they fighting about? What happened in Atlantic City? What was this woman's place there, Ilya Somin, that Donald Trump wanted?
Well, what Jeb Bush said was basically correct. Donald Trump wanted to build a parking lot for one of his casinos, but in order to do that, he needed to acquire the property of several people, including this elderly widow's home. Her name was Vera Koking. She didn't want to sell, so Donald Trump successfully lobbied the government to condemn her property, and he would have gotten away with it but for the fact that a court struck down the condemnation, saying it wasn't for any kind of legitimate public purpose. So Donald Trump was not telling the truth when he said that he just walked away. The only reason why he walked away is because he lost in court.
Happened to her. She had bought this house with her husband. It was right there. In fact, ultimately, first, didn't Carl Icahn buy it?
I'm not sure about that, but I do know that she had refused previous offers from other people to buy it from her, and she also did not want to sell to Donald Trump, which I think is fine. That is her right, and the government should not have tried to use the force of eminent domain to take it from her.
Now, Donald Trump ultimately did not succeed in getting her house right before he went bankrupt there.
Yes, that's right. But the only reason why he didn't succeed is because a court struck down the condemnation that he had lobbied for.
So fit this into the larger eminent domain debate in this country.
Certainly. There's been a long-standing debate about whether courts should supervise eminent domain and enforce the public use provision of the Fifth Amendment, which says that the government can only take property for a public use, such as a road or a bridge or some other sort of public facility. And on the other side are people like Donald Trump, who argued that the government should be able to take property for virtually any reason, including transferring it to a private developer like Trump, and often the private developer isn't even required to produce the economic benefits that supposedly justified the condemnation in the first place.
Finally, Donald Trump, after the debate, went on the talk shows yesterday and said that, in fact, the Bush family, not Jeb Bush himself, it was actually George W. Bush, had also used eminent domain in Texas to condemn property to build a stadium for his team.
That's basically correct, although it was actually a parking lot for the stadium rather than the stadium itself. I think what George W. Bush did there was wrong, but it in no way justifies what Donald Trump did. Neither one of them should have been permitted to use eminent domain for this sort of purpose.
Well, Ilya Somin, I want to thank you for being with us. Professor of law at George Mason University, writes for the Washington Post blog, The Volokh Conspiracy. His latest piece, Donald Trump's lightweight defense of taking property for private development. This is Democracy Now!